All right, so today's lesson 4. So we're only going to have one video for today's class. So here's our agenda for today. We want to review the tip calculator that we were working on last week. We just want to finish that. I'll maybe ask, well, Thomas posted a solution to the full calculator. So maybe I can kind of ask him to take the controls, bend it as well. Some other people may have as well. So there's many different ways to skin this cat. So anyway, we can look at one solution, and I won't necessarily go through line by line, but if people have questions, we can kind of go over that. So we'll do that at the beginning. Then we're going to make a new solution, and we'll probably have about an hour to work with intents. So how do we navigate from activity to activity and then back within an Android app? But also, how do we get an activity to do other things? Send an email, send a text message, access a web browser, etc. So we'll do that in a really kind of simple way. We'll build a little 2-activity app and look at navigating back and forth. We'll look at passing data from one activity to the next. And then we'll look at how do we, for example, by the end, the solution we want is have the user enter a URL on the first activity, have them go to the next activity, and then give them the opportunity to launch a browser to go directly to that, whatever URL they've entered. So we should be able to get all that working, and we'll try to wrap up by a little bit after 9, try to take a break by 9:05. I want to finish, we'll have 20 minutes, and then the Farm Tech students are going to be here for 9:30, okay? We've already matched up the groups, so I've numbered our groups 1 to 6, along with your names. They've numbered their groups 1 to 6, so everybody, we've already kind of planned who's working with who. Okay, so here was where we left our tip calculator. Actually, no, this is not the right solution. Sorry, bear with me. Yep. Yes. Sorry. They will be discussing what they need. Would help if I opened the right. So where did we? It was our calculators. Sorry. Opened the wrong project. So I'll just get this one running. So here's how we left it off last week. We had a text changed event where we could set the tip and total when we entered an amount, but we hadn't yet dealt with the tip working with the seek bar. So I think if I entered values here, blocker is working. Yes, so we probably also need a little if statement there. Okay, so that's a good point. So what can we do in here on this on text changed? What do we want to do? Yeah, so we don't want it to try to calculate. Yeah, okay, so. Both would be correct. I would suggest, personally, I think I would prefer the if, because a try catch is usually we're sort of checking for unexpected things, whereas I would suggest somebody clearing out the text is something we could reasonably expect. Not wrong to do try catch. I believe we can also do that through, well, we may have to look. So here, if I hit. It's to do with we set up the input type as numeric on the edit text. So we're okay there. We did actually. I thought we did, but I wanted to check. No. No. It will only accept. So I think we're okay there. Okay, so if you wrote an if statement, what if statement could we put in here that would work to prevent that from running? All right, how'd you do it? Perfect. Only do this if our character string is not empty. So that should solve that issue. Again, if you want to use a try catch, you can, but I would recommend this. I would prefer this approach because this is expected. Okay. So now if we rerun it, that should prevent us from getting this error. We could also put in an else here. I guess we could put in an else where we set those text values back to empty because it's still showing the previous tip and total. Sure. That would work as well, right? And we could move the calculator. Yeah, so we could take the calculate out of the if. We'll calculate regardless, but we can reset the bill amount to 0. That should work. We kind of clean that and reset our form. Okay, so now we want to deal with this. We want to deal with our seek bar on change listener so that we can slide this. We want to update the text view here to match the current seek bar value and then calculate. So what will we need to do? We've added our text change listener. How are we going to get the seek bar to work? Anybody able to do it and maybe can share? Yeah, we have our seek bar reference here. Now, if we look on create, however, and it's instantiated here, but there's no listener. So we won't be on seek bar change listener. Yep. So we're going to really want the progress changed. Okay. So what do you have in this method? How does it go? Yeah. Okay, that's fine. So, okay. Yeah, we could do it in the same. All right. So we did text view. Set the text. Later, we could actually use a formatting expression, but for now, we can just hard code in the % sign after. Let's just try that and see whether that listener works, that progress change listener works. If we drag the seek bar, we should see the numeric value on our text view change. So the percentage here, okay, that's not tip text view. That should be the percent text view. Label off on the left side. So that adjusts, which is good. So then what else has to happen? So our see my variable name, it's our tip percent. We also want to update. And then we can try to run our calculation. So it is working. We probably want to show this as an actual percentage rather than decimal, but our calculation. Our format's not quite right because notice this is showing, sorry. So we would want to add formatting here. We probably want to show that just as a percentage and we want to show them as currency. But our calculations are right. If we do this in the on-stop tracking, yes, we could do it there as well. In that case, it wouldn't update until we stop moving the seek bar. So that would be fine. Here it's as we're moving it, if I don't let go, it continues to update. Or we could have it on, but we could call that method on both listeners, both events, stop tracking and progress change. Both would be fine. So we may want to take this. We do this first. So this will maybe show it. Oh, here you just did progress. Yeah. Right. Okay. All right. Okay. Any questions about the tip calculator? Morning. I got your email. Thank you. I'll clean this code up a bit and then I'll post it to GitHub as well. Okay, I'll add the formatting for currency and percentage, which will simplify it a bit. I'll do that on my own time and I'll post it to GitHub. Anybody able to do the full calculator? You're able to do full? Few of you? Okay. Now Thomas did share this repo. It's here, so I think he posted the link. I will post it. He said he was willing to share it. So I'll just put it into week 3. So I'll load it up. You can have so the link is now on Blackboard, the repository, if you want. I'll run it so you can have a look at it. We can have a quick look through it. Don't sit down yet. I'm showing your calculator. I've shared the link. I hope that's okay. And maybe if people have questions about it. So I'm just going to run it. So you did it so that if they do multiple operations. Yeah, it just goes left. Right. Thanks for clear work. Okay, so I'll just so here's the code. If anybody's got any questions about how anything was done, you can talk to the developer. So you had a single press method where you just interpreted.
And then the calculate basically takes that string on the top line with smaller text.
Here, come up here so your voice is at least captured in the video.
So the calculate basically takes that string on the top line. Use your mouse. This string here and parses it. So it splits it into by the equal sign first, so that if you have a bunch in there, then it's going to split it on the equal sign and take the last one because these ones are already calculated. So grabs the last one, turns that into the current equation. Then it splits that on space because all the operators have a space around them. So it's like space plus space, space, space times space. And then it takes that and just runs it through each of those. And it stores if it's an operator. So if it matches a plus, minus, times, or divide, then it stores that as the operator that it needs to use. And then if it is an equal sign, it doesn't do anything. And then otherwise, it's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 0. So it comes down to here. And depending on what the operator is, it just adds it, subtracts it, multiplies it, or divides it. And then returns the value to here. And then if it's a decimal, it puts it on there. But then if it no longer needs a decimal, it takes it. It doesn't do the 0.0 that a float normally does. That's what this piece here is for, which I actually got from Stack Overflow. I didn't know how to do that. I did not actually. That probably fails. Pardon? Like a plus? Actually, off the bat you can't. Or sorry, you can. I didn't check for that. But if you try to go like this and then put another plus, it won't work. Or if you put a minus, it switches it out. So it switches out your operator. And then also, if you add something and equals it, then you can. Sorry, plus 3 equals. Oh, Rich, I think you have an old version of the code. I updated something last night to fix it so you can't start adding numbers on the end like that. So what happened there is it has the result. Yeah, so it has the result there, and then when you start typing again, it just adds it onto the end. I fixed that error as well.
So that's all in the Git repository.
Yeah, in the updated repo. And then that's pretty much it. This just appends add to equation, just is what is appending it to this string up here. And then clear. Clear is pretty simple.
Cool. Thanks. I think I haven't totally decided, but I think that something like this exercise is probably what the midterm will be. I'll just give you one app to build with some requirements, and it will be open book. Okay, so there's no question answer, there's no memory. It's just go ahead and I'll have you build something along these lines where you'll have time. It obviously isn't going to be the calculator, but what I would suggest is, I saw some hands, so some people finished the calculator, some people started and got partway through, some of you probably didn't attempt it. If you don't have a working one, doesn't necessarily have to have all the features, but at least the base functionality of being able to do a math of one of the 4 base operators on 2 whole numbers, I would suggest over the next couple of weeks, this would be a good exercise, even if you use Thomas's repo as a reference. Good practice to go ahead and try and get your own version of the calculator working. Okay, that'll be good. That'll be good practice for the midterm. Okay. And this is probably about the scale of what I'll ask you to do. I'll just ask you to build one app that has similar kind of requirements that I imagine within 3 hours you should be able to do. Sure. So it is constraint. You just use the default constraint layout, and most of the constraints were just relative to each other. Right, so you've just used the parent constraints here, right, for the top row.
Yeah, it's basically the 7 is like side and up. The decimal is here down side, and then everything just goes right to left.
And then you used margins as well, so that they're spaced equidistant. And normally, probably to save for efficiency, not wrong that you didn't, but probably not a bad idea to use some dimension resources for those standard things like the text size and the margins. These could easily go in the dimensions as resources. So then you could just reference those resources rather than hard coding the numeric values into the layout. And in this version, Thomas did all the event handling through the XML. So you generated the on-click handlers here rather than adding the listeners for all the buttons in the on-create. So the link is now here in Blackboard. So there was the exercise, and here's the solution. The link to his repository is here. So you can use that as a reference. So again, not a bad idea. To finish the calculator, use the repository as a reference if you're stuck. All right. Okay, so we got about 40 minutes or so. We're going to talk about intents today. We will probably never build apps without intents unless it's a single activity app, which there aren't a whole lot of. So basically, an intent really is a way of sending a message from within the Android app, and there's 2 different kinds. There's an explicit one where we are typically used to call another class, usually an activity within our app. So activity 1 wants to open activity 2, for example. The second one is implicit, and implicit is typically we're performing some other kind of action on the device outside of our app. And the reason that it's implicit is these operations can often be handled by different apps on the device, right? So for example, we want to send an email. Well, maybe we have both the native email client and the Outlook app on our phone, right? So it's a question of which app is going to perform that action. We want to load a web page. Are we using Chrome? Are we using Firefox? Or are we using a different browser on the device? So sometimes the OS is going to automatically know how to process that. Other times it's going to give the users a choice, right? We've all seen that. We want to perform an operation from one app to another one, and we'll be prompted which app do you want to use to do this. So implicit really, it's when we don't care which app is actually performing this. And explicit is very clearly, we know exactly what component is gonna do this operation. So a really common one for an explicit intent is basically one activity opening another one, right? So we've got a master detail. We have a list of data. We click on one record in there, and then we want to see another activity that shows us the details. So that's probably our most common one. There's actually templates for this in Android Studio. We can actually set up a project, and instead of an empty activity or a blank activity, there's actually a master detail template that will set up two activities where there's explicit intents already baked into the code. We can even maybe fire one of those up and see. So two required parameters. So the current context that we're calling from, and then what component do we want to interact with? Do we want to invoke or call? Occasionally, there's an optional parameter, which is the data URI, where we may need to refer to a specific resource in order to be able to do this. We don't need that a lot of the time with explicit intents. So navigating to a new activity, which we're going to implement shortly, is as simple as this. So we've got a main activity, we have a button, and we've got an on-click listener. So here is how we would instantiate and open a detail activity from the main. We create a new intent, so our context is the main activity. Our component that we're trying to invoke is our detail activity, and then we just call start activity and pass the intent to it. That's going to load our next screen. So we'll do that. That's pretty simple. We also want to think about, right, our devices have a back button. So how do we go back? What happens in this case? And we sort of looked briefly at the back stack last week, or at least I meant to. I may have skipped that slide. I meant to show you. So in this case, user clicks back. All we have to do is call finish. That original activity is not actually destroyed. It's just paused. And it gets resumed when we close the second activity. So it looks something like this. So we have a back stack. So every time a user clicks back, so we're in 1, we open 2. We're in 2, we open 3. If we click back, it destroys activity 3. So then we'd have to reinstantiate it if we go back. But activity 2 and 1 are still here in the stack. Now we have control over this. If we have a lot of activities and that stack may get really large for memory reasons, at some point we may want to do more than just pause these. We may want to destroy them if they're far enough back in the stack, because it may slow down our app. It may eat up also a lot of memory and battery life on the device. So that's something to be mindful of when we're kind of building this navigation structure. So our activity is first paused and then stopped, but it's not destroyed immediately when we go back. The other thing that we often want to do with an explicit intent is we want to pass it some data, right? If we're going to go from master to detail, what data does that detail activity need? Yeah, I'm asking. Oh, so we got a master that pulls up. Yeah, it would probably be the ID the user touched to select. So it's not enough to just open the detail activity is to know what record do we want to access. So we have this extra class. So we have a method called put extra, and extras are just a set of key value pairs. So think of it almost like using query string variables on a URL, right? We have a key, we have a value, so we can pass values along a link from one web page to another. So extras work in the same way. We can define multiple extras to pass, so multiple keys, each with a value. So we call put extra to set. So we do this before we start our next activity. So here I want to pass a hex color called constant color. I want to pass that from my first to my second activity. So then in my second activity, blow this up. There's a bundle object, and if we get extras, that gives us a collection of those key value pairs. And then we can reference with the get string and the name of any extra key name. That'll give us that value. So set it on the first activity, set it into an extra, read it out of the extra on the second activity. Okay. The other thing that we can do is we can actually return results. So we go from activity 1 to activity 2. We do something on activity 2. We can actually send a result. But we're done on activity 2. We want to go back. We can send a result. So we've got this. There's a set result method here, almost like an HTTP status code in an API, right? We can send data, and we can send a 200 OK response or a 404 not found response, where we've got a code, a status result, and some data along with it. So we can do the same here, right? We want to save a new object to our database. We want to return to a previous activity, let that activity know this worked, and here's our new data, for example. It contains maybe our new ID. So that's kind of the explicit intents. The implicit intents look a bit more like this. So I tap on a map. Well, I've got multiple apps on my device that can show me a map. So I click on website. If I've got all these browsers, one of two things is going to happen, right? Either my device is going to show me all 4 of these and say, how do you want to open this? Or if it's already given me that choice, it usually gives me an option that says, remember this choice, right? Set it as a default. So for example, on my Android device, every time I click on a URL, I said it'll just open Firefox automatically now. It's not going to prompt me to open Chrome. So the implicit intents are a little different. The component that we're invoking, that's actually an optional parameter that we don't use a lot of the time. We can send extras, so if we want to send specific data to an implicit intent, we can. So for example, if what we want to do is send an email, in the extras, we might choose to put in the recipient, the subject in that intent. So automatically, our email message comes up and the recipient and the subject are pre-filled. That's an option we can include in the intent. But really what we want to know is what is the action that we're doing? Opening a browser, sending an SMS, making a phone call, sending an email, looking up a location on the GPS. So that's our action. What are we doing? And then we've got to have some kind of URI. So for example, URL to a web page, a number to an SMS or a phone call. We have to include those things. So here's what an implicit intent might look like, for example. So our action is send to, and the extras, so we don't have to include these. These are optional. We could just create a blank email message, but in this case, we want to pre-fill the email message with a subject and text. So that's what those extras parameters would be in this case. And then we start the activity. So that's the same, whether it's explicit or implicit, then that's going to basically let Android figure out what application to use to perform that action, or whether it's got multiple options and it's going to ask the user to choose. How do you want to do this? What app should handle this? The other important thing with implicit intents is by default in Android, every intent basically runs within the sandbox of the application it's called from. So this is simple if we're using explicit intents. Go from activity 1 to activity 2 within our one app. It knows. As soon as we ask something to happen outside of the sandbox our app is running in, we need to have permissions. So if that is using the browser, we'll need an internet permission. If it's using the GPS, we'll need a location permission. And those are generally set in the Android manifest. So we just need a permission node. We've got to specify what permissions this app needs. And that's why, that's what you see. This is what gets translated in the Play Store. When you look up an app in the store and it shows you, first of all, what permissions the app will use. And also when you go to install it, you get that little pop-up saying, you know, this app requires access to your contacts, location, browser, and it allows you to deny or grant those permissions. Right? That's based on these permissions that are set in the Android manifest. So we do have to think about if our app, if we've got implicit intents, what things on the device does it need access to? Okay, and users basically, they can deny those things, but hey, if they deny internet permission on our app, means anytime they tap on a URL, nothing's going to happen, or they'll get a permission denied error if they don't enable those permissions. So as a general guideline, no permissions are granted outside of our app, and we basically only grant permissions that our app really needs, right? Make it as minimally invasive to the rest of their device as possible. If we don't need their contacts, don't ask for permission to their contacts or their location. All right, there's the overview. If you want to see those as a reference, those are here. All right, so let's play around with this. Thanks again for today. I'll choose the empty activity. Here's that master detail activity, by the way. You want to use it. And it's fine in your assignments. If you choose, you don't have to build them from scratch with empty activities. If you want to use one of these templates to get you started and leverage what's in Android Studio, by all means. I'm not going to insist you do the layouts entirely from scratch. No problem if you want to use those because it's going to be more efficient. But for today, an empty activity, call it intents. And I'll basically leave the rest of the defaults. So we've got our regular main activity with a hello world. Textview, we'll get rid of that. First thing we want to do is add a second activity. You can call it anything you like. I'll maybe just call mine detail activity. Actually, no, I won't. I'll call it, well, whatever. Doesn't really matter what we call it. So I'll just make a new, click on File, New, Activity, and I'll add a second empty activity. I'll just call it second activity. Doesn't matter what you call it. File, New, and I will get into activity down here. Section of the context menu at the bottom, and then I pick empty activity. So notice, if I open up the Android manifest, it now has references to both our activities. So the main activity was here right from the beginning, and it's set as the main and the launcher activity. So that basically means when we start our app, that's the activity that runs. When we created the second activity, we get an additional node in our Android manifest. So let's go to our activity main. I'm going to take out, actually, you know what? Rather than take out my text view, I'm actually just going to turn this into a button because it's already anchored in the middle where we want it. So I'm actually just going to change this to a button. We'll change the text here. I'll create a resource called next. And then I'll just highlight this, hit Alt Enter, and I'll create a string resource called next. So we'll have a button in the middle of our main activity that says next. I'll just put the value on as next with a couple of arrows. If you want to delete the text view and add the button, that's fine. I figured I'd keep it, it's more efficient. It already has all the constraints that I want. I'll give it an ID. So plus ID, I'll just call it next button. And I'll run the app just to see. Looks okay here in design view, but we never know for sure until we run it. So our first thing we want to do with this, once we'll just make sure it looks okay, our button isn't going to do anything yet. The first thing we'll want it to do is we'll write a click handler that when we click it, it's just going to open the second activity. Okay, so we'll use an explicit intent to instantiate an instance of the second activity and then start it. So it looks okay, it's in the right place, that's fine. Now you can add your on-click handler, you can create the click event listener in the Java code, or we can do it through here. Rick? Yes. And I called mine second activity. You can call yours whatever you like. The name's not really important. Yeah. Well, I'll just add an on click and I'll create a method called show second activity. Call it anything you like. And I'll use the context menu to create an on-click event handler. And it says, ask me which activity, where do I want the handler? Well, I want it in the main activity. So I'll just pick main activity. So now when I click this button, it's going to call this method. So all we need to do here is create a new explicit intent and then call start activity and pass that intent as a parameter. We've got two parameters, the context which is our app context. So this is our whole application. It's not the class itself. We want second activity is the component instantiating. Doesn't know what an intent is, so we just need to make a reference to the Android intent class. So hit Alt Enter. Now we've got an import to Android content.intent. Or you can manually add that reference. So we just call start activity. Fairly simple to navigate from one activity to the next. Create the intent, call start, pass the intent to it. So we can try this out. If you run it now, click your next button, you should get jumped to your second activity. Remember, our first activity is not destroyed, it's still there. If we get to our second activity and click back, we should go back to the first activity with all of the state preserved. As we'll see in a minute. Okay. So we click next, we get our blank second activity. Click back, and we're back to the first activity. Anybody have questions so far? So the next thing we want to do with this is add an edit text onto the first activity. And then we want to use that extra object to pass the contents of the edit text to the second activity. So user can type something here, load the second activity, and we can pass whatever they typed to the second activity, which we can then display. So we're going to both read and write an extra. And once we have that working, the last thing we're going to do, which we should be able to do in the time we have left, is we're going to use an implicit intent. So right now we've used an explicit intent to load one activity. What we want to do is we want to prompt users to enter a URL. And when they go to the next page, we'll add a button to take that URL and then use an implicit intent to load that in a browser. So let's go back to our activity main. I'm going to add an edit text. Now there isn't actually a text view for a URL directly. Let's see if we don't want web view. That's actually a browser. I'm going to search for edit text. It doesn't even show us it. Okay, so I'm going to do it through here. I'm going to add an edit text. My layout width will match the parent. My height will wrap the content. So it'll be the entire width. Give it an ID of URL edit text. I'll create a string resource here for the hint. We'll come back and populate the string resource in a minute. We'll make this span the whole width, so height will be parent, And we'll say our bottom, top of our button. So our edit text will appear above button. So on our button, I'm going to say now bottom is now to the top of. We're going to change that constraint on line 22. Our button top is no longer constrained to the top of the activity of the layout. It's constrained below the edit text. Should look something like this now. I'm going to extract my string resource here. I'm going to create. Oops. I'll put in my hint as enter URL here. We're missing something. I'm also going to set my text alignment with center. Actually, no, maybe I'll make my width, 0 OP. Whoops. This should be, sorry, I messed up my constraints. This should be parent. This should be top to bottom. We'll fix our problem. Got to do one more thing, obviously, with my constraints. Okay. Not quite right. Let's see. Our edit text need the top to top of. Okay. So we want to be able to enter URL. So now we want to pass whatever value is in that text view to the second activity. And notice when I click back, whatever values are in the first activity, they persist. Because remember, it's not destroyed, it's just paused. We don't lose the previous values. It doesn't need to be refreshed or reloaded. So now in my click event, I want to grab the text property of my edit text, put that in an extra and pass that along to the second activity. So before we start the second activity, we're going to take our intent and we're going to use the put extra method. A whole bunch of overloads. We'll create an extra called URL. We need a reference to our edit text. We'll make a reference to the edit text. We'll declare it here, and we'll instantiate it. Activity is created. Now we've got a reference, global reference in this class to our edit text. And then we can just use the get text method here. We'll grab whatever text is entered in the text view. We'll store it in an extra called URL. But then we'll have access to this value in our next activity. We're writing the value here. We can read it on the next activity. If we run the app now, we won't see any changes. We're simply storing this value behind the scenes. We haven't broken anything, but we're not doing anything with that value yet. So on our second activity, we want to add two things here. We want to add a text view and we want to add a button to the second activity. So to save us a bit of time, I'm actually going to copy these two and paste them, and then I'll make some changes. Or you could start from scratch by adding a text view, not an edit text. We just want a text view and a button on our second activity, which is blank right now. I'll just copy those. No, actually, I guess I can do it. Whatever, you can copy and change them. So I'll add a text view and I'll add a button. So my text view, I'll call it URL view. So this is just going to display the URL. And if we set our constraints, actually I'm going to provide IDs. So my button, we'll call it our launch button. And I can set up the constraints. So my text view's bottom will be to the top of the button. My text views left and right will be to the, and top will be to the parent. And my button, the bottom is to the top of my top. Let's start with left and right. I'm going to take out the text property of the text view because we're going to use our extra to populate it. Okay, when I go into my design view, I'm going to take out that I have an absolute Y. We'll get rid of that. Top will be to the bottom of URL text. Okay. And our button text will create a string resource. We'll add a string resource called launch. My button will say launch. Okay, I'm gonna ignore that. So we'll try and run it. My string crash creating my string resource. Text equals. Oh. There's my XML. So now we want to read the extra and write the URL on this text view. And then we'll add some code to launch an implicit intent. Okay, I know I'm going fairly quickly. I want to try to get through and record all this. Our break may have to be a bit shorter today. So we're going to need a reference to our text view here so that we can write text on it. So we'll write our import statement, reference the text view widget. So now we want to use that bundle object to grab our extras, and then we can read the URL that got passed from the first activity. So this gives us access to the extras collection of the intent. We're just reading the key that was passed in called URL. And we can just set the text. So this should display in our text view whatever was entered in the edit text on the previous activity. We enter ABC, our text view on the second activity should say ABC. All right, well, that works spectacularly well. What are we missing? Sorry, yes, thank you. Good call. It's funny, I went through this whole example yesterday and did the exact same thing. Yes, I'm referencing the wrong object. Yes, I referenced the wrong object. This is not an edit text on this activity, it's just a plain text view. It's read only. Okay. Good question. I believe there is a way to do it, yes. But I have to think about it. I believe it's possible. Now it renders small, but it renders the URL. So pass it in the extra, then read it into the extra. So the last thing I want to do is generate a click event on our launch button that will use an implicit intent. And we may have to set a permission in the Android manifest to allow that to happen. So I'll go back to my XML. I'll add a click handler. Create a method called launch URL. Use the context menu to generate a non-click event handler. And this is in second activity. So the first thing we're going to do is set up that URL variable. I'll just put it in a variable. We don't have to use a variable here. We could just reference this whole thing in our intent call. I'm just going to simplify it. We're going to make a new intent. This one's implicit. So what we want to use is action U. So there's a link here. I'll reference my intents. This is where we've got to supply that data URL. Right? What are we viewing? It's not enough to just say we want to view. We have to view something specific. So in our intent, we're going to call the set data method. So we want to call URI.parse and pass in the URL. We'll import a reference to android.net.uri, and then we can start the activity. I'm not sure if this will work or we're going to need to add the permission in the manifest. I will try it. So now we'll try to launch. So it uses the default app on the device to load the URL. If I go back and go back again, so these are the basics, kind of at its simplest, our simplest version of an explicit and an implicit intent, and how we pass data. So in terms of thinking about your app and how you're going to move from screen to screen, you're basically just going to use these explicit intents and use the extras for passing the data. So I'm sorry, this took me a little longer than I wanted to. So let's take a break here. The only thing I'm going to suggest you may want to try with this is you can play around on your own, see if you can add another implicit intent to do something else, right? See if you can get it to add another button where you send a text, make a phone call, send an email. You can see how those permissions work. Okay. Can we go back to the second? Sure. Okay. So let's take a break. I'm sorry, we'll have to keep it fairly short. Try to come back for about 9:25 if you can, because the other students will be here at 9:30. Okay. I will push this code up to GitHub as well.